folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.
Welcome back to the history of New Orleans. We last left off at the end of the 19th century and New Orleans' emergence into the 20th. Before we continue our steady march forward through the history of this great city, let's take this chance to look back on how New Orleans had changed over the last 100 years. At the dawn of the 19th century, New Orleans was a Spanish colony with a population of less than 10,000. Of these residents, most were French Creoles, either from France or from her colonies. They would soon be joined by a flood of refugees from the French colony of Saint-Domingue, or what we now call Haiti. The rest of the population was either Spanish administrators, traders from Britain and the newly independent United States of America, or, of course, enslaved black people. Most of the enslaved, as well as the sizable free black population, never touched African soil. They were born in New Orleans or on the surrounding plantations, and had as strong a claim to calling the Crescent City their home as any of the white residents. Shortly after the 19th century began, New Orleans underwent dramatic changes that turned it from a backwater colonial trading hub into the jewel of the American South. It transitioned from a Spanish colony to a French possession briefly, before being sold to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase. During this time, its population tripled, and then continued to rapidly grow throughout the century until it reached nearly 300,000 inhabitants. This level of growth over a relatively short period could never happen within an isolated community. Therefore, most of the growth came from outsiders moving to New Orleans as opportunities arose. The demographics of the city quickly diversified, as newcomers from America, Ireland, Italy, China, Great Britain, Cuba, Mexico, you name the country, and there was probably someone, or a large group of someones from that country, that came to settle in New Orleans during this time. As the population grew and diversified, the culture of the city also morphed and became more complex, as it assimilated the plethora of new ideas and traditions brought by all its new sons and daughters. There would always be a French hue that colored the Crescent City, quite unique among other American metropoles. But as time went on and New Orleans deviated from its history as a French colony, this hue slowly faded, or rather shifted into the mixture to become one part, an important part, of the overall color that could be recognized by any visitor as particularly New Orleanian. When the 20th century began, at least a quarter of the city spoke French daily, and another half had enough education in the Gallic language to conduct business in it. But the replacement of French with English was inevitable, as exclusively French schools were banned in the late 1800s. From then on, it would be on the onus of the family to educate their children in their French heritage, and as time went on, more and more people lost interest in this task. By 1923, the last French-language newspaper shuttered its doors, one instance among many that illustrated the retreat of French culture's dominance in New Orleans. It could never fully be erased, but going forward it would be more of an amusing peculiarity in New Orleans' character than the driving force of it. There were a great many bright, happy, and colorful events that happened during the 19th century to contribute to this spectacular realigning of the concoction of culture, including the advent of the Mardi Gras Parade, the Cotton Centennial Celebration, the construction of many of the beautiful buildings that stand out as you walk the newly paved streets of the Crescent City, and music, from the opera houses to the seediest saloon, which had always been a pivotal part of New Orleans, blossomed during this time. There were also many hardships that, while the residents did their best to move on from and forget, also shaped the spirit and character of the city. From the brutality of antebellum slavery to the horror of the Civil War and the bitterness of Reconstruction, there were plenty of things to be sad or ashamed about for the citizens of New Orleans during the 19th century, but just as we cherish and celebrate the beauty of the city, we cannot ignore its dark side. Although there were issues that had plagued the city for decades and would continue to leave scars on its image as the Big Easy lumbered into the 20th century, it was full of hope and optimism. The stagnation of the Reconstruction era had given way to the Gilded Age, where economic opportunity flourished across America, although not for everyone. As its name suggests, the age saw a thin gold leaf cover the ugly underside of America at this time, giving those that did not look too closely the impression that all was well. And indeed, if we do just look at the surface of New Orleans, the Gilded Age was a time of progress. Violence and fraud that had marred the politics in the city since before the Civil War seemed to have given way to a consensus among the population that the Democratic Party, led by the Ring, would preside over the city while making concessions to reform-minded groups to stave off revolution. Those who did not find this arrangement satisfactory to their needs were not united enough or powerful enough to challenge the established order, so there was very little debate within the political arena. This breakdown of the opposition within New Orleans and throughout much of the American South was personified with the singular figure of Martin Berman, who first entered the office of mayor of New Orleans in 1904 and would not exit it until 1920, making him up to that point by far the longest-serving elected official in the city's history. Berman was a creature of the Ring, a party man through and through, but he recognized that the party's success could only continue if graft and corruption was kept at a level in which it could be covered up or explained away, should the general populace complain. Not that this was a particularly pressing issue. The ascendancy of the Ring was so complete that even though the election rules had been changed to get rid of the practice of candidates being nominated through a convention in favor of a primary, Berman was easily renominated and won the election in a complete blowout. The two other candidates in 1908 earned a combined total of 273 votes to his 25,914. The public's near unanimous approval, as shown through this electoral triumph, can largely be attributed to the fortunate succession of beneficial administrations who, driven by the spirit of the progressive era of politics in America, were firmly committed to the general improvement of the city. This meant that Berman didn't have to make any radical changes when he came into office. He simply had to continue to build off the development and improvement that his predecessors had started. There was a lot of good work that went into the city during the 16 years Berman held court, and there were a lot of numbers we could rattle off to illustrate this point. Rather than just go down the laundry list of every budget item, I will break it down into 4 sections, which we will quickly go over, these being public safety, public health, education, and general improvement. The realm of public safety encompasses the police and fire departments. These two departments have always been a hotly contested issue in the political arena and have undergone so many different organizational iterations that even the most data-driven historians have lost count. So rather than go into depth of the exact structure of these departments as they existed in the first 20 years of the 20th century, we will focus on the change in some key numbers. For instance, the police department had around 347 full-time employed officers at the start of the century. By 1920, there were only 19 additional officers. This was despite the fact that the population and area policed by the department had significantly increased during this time period. Either there were far too many officers in 1900, or there were far too few in 1920. We cannot say with certainty, but a summary of all these changes later in the episode might shed some light on this question. Moving on to the fire department, the greatest change they saw did not come from direct investment in it from the government. Rather, it was from the improvement of the general water pumping capacity of the city during these 2 decades that made the job of the firemen much easier. In 1904, water was able to be supplied to about 125 miles of street, a fraction of the total city. Additionally, the water pumps that fed the hydrants on these lucky streets were pitiful. Many buildings were destroyed by fires when the pressure dropped and the fighters were unable to suppress the flames. By 1920, however, the greatly improved waterworks of New Orleans provided much more water to over 600 miles of streets at much higher pressure. With this new abundance of water, there was a great expansion of the equipment and manpower of the fire department. The department staff rose to over 460 men, 27 fire engines, which were now motorized rather than horse-drawn, and 2 water towers erected to further supply the department with its desired ammunition. Undoubtedly, the capacity of the fire department to keep New Orleans from burning to the ground, which it practically had twice in the city's history, was greatly expanded during this time. Moving on to public health, it too was a beneficiary of the general investment into water pumping infrastructure. In this case, it was the pumping of water out of the city rather than into it. Since it had been built in 1718, New Orleans had always been a swamp city. Levees had to be constructed to keep the floodwaters out, and drainage ditches were constantly being dug to try and keep the city dry. Aside from the fact that most of the municipal area was under sea level, Louisiana holds the distinction as the wettest state in the continental United States, with the highest average rainfall per year. It took nearly 200 years for the technology to finally catch up to nature, but by 1900, the city was finally able to pump enough water to drain the surrounding swampland and keep the stagnant pools of water out of the streets, which served as perfect breeding grounds of disease-carrying insects. The effect was the near-complete eradication of the disease that had plagued the city year after year, yellow fever. The last recorded epidemic of the disease was recorded in 1905, when the death toll was noticeably lowered due to not only the drier conditions, but also proper investment into the public health sector. In 1898, the government established the New Orleans City Board of Health to conduct an inspection of the municipality and provide suggestions for ways the health of its citizens could further be improved. Under their supervision, the slums of the city were cleaned up, new laboratories dedicated to the study of communicable diseases were constructed, and policies regulating sanitation and food safety were enacted. As a result, the average life expectancy of a New Orleans citizen jumped up 12 years during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and the death rate from infectious diseases such as malaria and typhoid plummeted. So just like the fire department, we can see that public health enjoyed an obvious increase in attention and spending under the Bourbon administration. On to the realm of education. The story of education in New Orleans has been, and will continue to be, a story of 2 distinct worlds. It is the most obvious example of the difference in opportunity between the black and white residents of the city. In the years between 1904 and 1920, the budget for the public school system of New Orleans quadrupled from $500,000 to over $2 million. The school-going population rose from just over 31,000 to 51,000. In order to accommodate the increase in students, 19 new school buildings were built, including 3 new high schools, which were segregated by both gender and race. The boys' schools were built at a much higher cost than the girls' schools, and the white schools likewise demanded more attention than the black schools. While in some cases money sunk into a school does not necessarily correlate to better education, in this case it was quite obvious by the difference in investment that the facilities at the white boys' school were much better than their counterparts. For example, 2 schools were built in 1907 and 1914 by the same developer. One was for white boys and it cost almost $46,000. The other, built for black boys, cost just over $25,000. Even the McDonough schools, which were built on land donated to the city by the exceedingly wealthy John McDonough for the express purpose of providing an equal opportunity of education for white children and children of color, saw noticeable discrepancies in the quality of facilities provided. When the Supreme Court ruled in the Plessy v. Ferguson case that we discussed last episode that separate but equal would be the law throughout America, everyone knew that the equal part could never coexist with the separate part, and the New Orleans school system was just the proof of that belief. Still, there were overall improvements being made to the whole department. In particular, the lives of teachers were greatly improved during the first 20 years of the 19th century. As we previously discussed, becoming a teacher in New Orleans was to commit oneself to a life of pauperism, as the fund for teachers' salaries in the city was either too small or tied down by bureaucratic red tape, so teachers had to beg their students for tuition just so they could feed themselves. Over the time period we are focused on today, the average salary of an educator rose 160%, finally allowing teachers to make a living wage. In response, the number of people willing to seek a career in education skyrocketed, with over 500 new teachers joining the service. While the issue of inequality still plagued education in New Orleans, we can take a little comfort in the fact that a rising tide lifts all boats. To illustrate this point, we will conclude our study of the administrative improvement of the city with a general overview of the betterment of the city in the 2 decades in question. In terms of raw numbers, perhaps the most important one to make note of is the dollar amount in exports from New Orleans' ports. New Orleans had always been a trade city. In just about every episode up to this point, we have made note of this fact, so it makes sense to try and measure how healthy of an environment the Crescent City is in based on how its year-to-year export total looks. While it took a hit in the last half of the 19th century due to increased competition from cities such as Chicago and St. Louis, the development of larger and larger ocean-going vessels, powered by huge steam engines rather than wind, meant that New Orleans' trade through ocean liner shipping exploded in the 20th century, despite its relative loss in railroad and river trade. The total amount in dollars exported in 1904 was just shy of 150 million. By 1920, this number had quadrupled to 600 million. Its chief export remained cotton, despite what the Confederates thought the end of slavery did not kill the cotton industry. In fact, the industrialization of agriculture meant there was more of the crop than ever, and New Orleans was still the largest cotton market in the world. Most of this cotton went to foreign markets, which meant that New Orleans was second only to New York in terms of foreign trade numbers. The increase in revenue from trade allowed the city to make the improvements needed to enter the modern era of the 20th century. The largest expenditure in this vein was actually paving. Unlike other cities of comparable size, the cost of paving the roads was borne mostly by the municipality, with the beneficiaries of the pavement, those that owned property along the roads, contributed around 21% of the funds. This arrangement was archaic and unsuitable, as the need for paving the roads was draining the city budget. To rectify the situation, a law was passed in the early 1900s, which flipped the onus of payment onto the property owners, which then allowed the city to continue the pavement projects without bankrupting the municipality. As a result, the public got terrific modern roads, which greatly improved the image and functionality of New Orleans, courtesy of wealthy landowners, who didn't really need the money anyway. Inspired by the way the paving issue was solved, the city further increased the financial obligations its wealthiest citizens owed in order to furnish new buildings. In 1912, 1913, and 1918, the famous French Market and its 2 most notable companions, the Dryads and Jefferson Markets, got new facilities. They were soon joined by several new markets, a new hospital, new public bathhouses, and a prison, all financed through an increase in property taxes. In fact, it wasn't just the public sector that was going on a building frenzy during the 1900s. Many private real estate developers sunk fortunes into construction in New Orleans. The amount invested by private citizens into new buildings in 1904 was around $260,000. In 1905, it spiked up to over $5 million and would continue to rise more gradually over the coming decade. Looked at in a vacuum, we can get the impression that the period of 1900 to 1920 was one of tremendous progress in New Orleans. Every department we discussed saw an increase in its budget and modernization efforts that improved their efficiency. The city also witnessed unprecedented investment into construction that really changed the face of old New Orleans into one that could more easily be mistaken for present-day New Orleans. However, this rosy view of the early 1900s is tarnished when we put it into context. As a part of the U.S. Census in 1918, there was a study comparing 69 cities in America with populations over 100,000. This study also compared the 11 cities in the South with populations over 100,000. Here's what it found. Of the 69 cities, New Orleans was 16th in population, quite a drop from when it had been the third most populous city in the 1840s, but still respectable. It did retain the honor of remaining the most populous city in the South. Of the 69 cities, New Orleans was around the middle of the pack in general government expenditures, health and sanitation, and property investment. Of the southern cities, it was near the top in these same 3 categories. The real story, though, is with the 4 areas we just covered in this episode. New Orleans was dead last in education, near the bottom in police and fire, and better than only 19 other cities in total government expenses. Even among southern cities, which were generally more impoverished, It ranked near the bottom in these categories. Despite noteworthy improvements being made between 1900 and 1920, New Orleans was still lagging behind the rest of the country. What could have been the cause of such shortfalls? That will be the focus of our next section of this episode. When looking into the shortcomings of New Orleans' government spending, it is most natural to look at the men who made up the government and why they were seemingly so negligent in their duty to foster the growth of their city. Berman and his colleagues weren't exactly malicious in their mismanagement of public funds, but when a select group of political insiders, such as the Ring, are able to completely wrest control of an area, stagnation inevitably follows. The lack of any effective opposition, reform or other, to Berman for a stretch of 16 years allowed the Democratic Ring to become complacent. Without the threat of electoral defeat, there was no real incentive to change anything or offer real progress, when maintaining the status quo was easier and more profitable for the Ring. So while the rest of the country spent the early years of the 20th century dumping massive sums of money into city development, New Orleans sat on its hands, blissfully unaware that it was lagging behind. Now, of course, the Ring can't take all the blame for this failure. There were private entities who sapped the opportunity for public improvement out of greed or incompetence, and there were, of course, the material conditions that must be considered. New Orleans, while large and important, was quite different materially from the large northern cities we are comparing it to. It had a different climate, different terrain, and different demographics. While the locations of New York, Chicago, and Detroit made them natural trade hubs just like New Orleans, they were not in the warm climate of the South, where cash crops like cotton and sugar could be grown. Because of this, they had to rely on supplementing their trade economy with an industrial base that turned the raw materials of iron, copper, and lumber into finished goods to be sold throughout the country and abroad. Maybe during the 1700s and early 1800s, New Orleans was able to outpace the economies of northern cities with its exports, but the abolition of slavery cut the legs out from under the plantation system and allowed these cities to catch up. By the time the 20th century rolled around, further technological development in the realm of heavy industry and a steady migration of workers northwards left New Orleans and the rest of the South in a state of underdevelopment. So even as New Orleans' export economy continued to grow, it was not nearly at the pace of northern industrial centers. A growing economy means a growing tax base, which could fund even more growth. It is a self-perpetuating cycle that is hard to get started, and it is obvious by our study of the numbers that New Orleans was struggling to get it going. Compounding on this difficulty were ideological issues in the ruling class of New Orleans that hampered its ability to truly accept the new century. Both within the city and the state of Louisiana, the Democratic Party was unchallenged in its power. This party was still, to a large extent, the party of Andrew Jackson, a populist party of conservative American values who saw government as a tool to help private interests. While this may have manifested in some instances as support for the development of New Orleans, it mostly sought to limit the role of government in the economy wherever possible. There was also the issue of contending with a population that did not always resemble the pastoral American frontiersman or the industrious self-reliant entrepreneur that is white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The Democratic Party of the South spent a considerable amount of its time and energy pruning the garden, a euphemistic way of saying it tried to make society look and operate in a way that ran opposite of what was morally and materially correct. Social progress, particularly in the realm of civil rights, was anathema to the democratic image, and so it was hindered at great expense to the government and the public. Not only was segregation and the continuing subjugation of women a moral stain on the South, it was also a drain on resources. Almost every type of public space, from cinemas to train cars, were segregated, necessitating the creation of separate and certainly not equal spaces for Black New Orleanians. While this didn't exactly double the burden of government investment, since they kept the cost of Black accommodations at a bare minimum, as we have seen with our discussion of the difference in budget for the building of Black and white schools, it nonetheless created an unnecessary additional cost to just about everything. Northern cities did not really have this same problem. They got around the issue of separating the races, not in heavy-handed Jim Crow way, but by creating pockets of ethnic enclaves which were then appropriated funds based on property tax and income, thus limiting the cost of providing for minority communities without overt laws calling for their separation. Just like how northern industry was more sophisticated and modern than southern industry, the racism was likewise. Perhaps if these material and political problems were the only thing holding New Orleans back from becoming a top 10 city in America, it could have been overcome with enough hard work and reform. However, this would not have been the case. In 1914, New Orleans would be shaken by something that had not affected it since 1803, a type of event that had once been the most impactful to the changing of its course in history. That is, a war in Europe. If you remember way back in episode 3, we discussed numerous conflicts, mostly between Britain and France, that greatly shifted New Orleans' trajectory. During the several wars that broke out in the 18th century in Europe, New Orleans had been cut off from the world and forced to reorient herself to an American continental focus. This last happened in the Napoleonic Wars, after which New Orleans officially became a part of the United States and no longer had to concern herself with the affairs of the European continent. In some way, after 1803, the world New Orleans lived in became smaller. Since it wasn't a part of the French, Spanish, or British empires that spanned the globe, its only connection to exotic places like India, China, and the East Indies was through very limited trade. Then, in 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, igniting the flame of what was to become known as the Great War, or World War I. This was the first conflict in almost a century that really disrupted the whole global order, and New Orleans was unable to escape its pull. Even when America declared itself neutral, New Orleans felt the impact on its trade with Europe heavily. As the allied nations of France and Britain blockaded the continent, and Germany implemented unrestricted submarine warfare, it became increasingly difficult for merchant ships from the Crescent City to turn a profit with one of its largest markets cut off by the war. This damaging of New Orleans' most vital industry made the citizens of the city more emotionally invested in the war than perhaps any other municipality in America. While isolationism would continue to be the prevailing attitude in the U.S. until the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmerman telegram, there were many in New Orleans who wanted America to take a more active role in the war from the beginning. The city was still home to a massive French-speaking population whose sympathies obviously lay with the Allies. Prominent Creole families raised funds to send to aid the Allies, and some even snuck over to Europe to join the war on the side of their ancestral country. It bears mentioning that there was also a sizable German-American population in New Orleans. While not as wealthy or as powerful as the Creoles, many of these Germans felt as strongly about the war but supported the Central Powers. As the war dragged on, however, the general public slowly turned against Germany, and by the time America eventually joined the fighting, German Americans found themselves in a dangerous minority position. Many would renounce their citizenship to Germany or hide aspects of their German culture to blend in with the pro-Ally crowd. Speaking of entering the war, it wasn't until 1917 that America finally declared war on the Central Powers, bringing the country and New Orleans directly into the conflict. The patriotic pro-war energy that had been building in the city since 1914 exploded into vigorous action on behalf of the war effort. The U.S. government issued Liberty Bonds to drum up funds for the war effort. They expected a sum of $91 million from New Orleans, but the city went above and beyond, raising a final amount of over $100 million. On top of all the money sent, there was a huge wave of energetic young New Orleans men who signed up to join the armed forces. Just as energetic and not wanting to be left on the sidelines, many New Orleans women pitched in wherever they were allowed, mostly as nurses or secretaries for the numerous training camps that propped up around the city. As New Orleans was one of the largest ports in America, it made sense that it was the key embarking point for men trained in the South. Due to the heavy influx of military men to the city, New Orleans' entertainment business flourished in the 2 years that America was involved. The allure of the city's many gambling houses and brothels brought the seedier side of the Crescent City into direct conflict with the U.S. military. Secretary of War Newton Baker had a particularly intense hatred of the Storyville district in New Orleans, which we will go into further detail on a little later. For now, we will wrap up our discussion on World War I in New Orleans with how the energy and optimism of 1917 turned on its head in 1918. An important thing to know about World War I was that every country involved in it started out with the same attitude. Europe had not experienced a continent-wide war since the days of Napoleon, and the horrors of war had slipped out of the public's consideration. They saw the outbreak of World War I as a chance to win glory for themselves and for their nation. That is why nationalism is recognized as one of the leading causes of the war. There was a romanticization of war and the honor of dying for one's country in a struggle against foreign barbarians. This sentiment was ubiquitous across the continent, and each country believed in their people's superiority, so naturally the war would be short, glorious, and not all that destructive. Reality set in pretty quickly that warfare in the modern age was the opposite of all of these. The famous Home by Christmas slogan was soon replaced with an inescapable sense of dread as millions of corpses piled up in the trenches. It was a senseless bloodletting with no honor, no glory, and seemingly no end in sight. Insulated from the true horror of the war, Americans were unable to reckon with its consequences, and so still maintained the early hopeful energy. Things began to change when instead of reading the casualty tallies in the newspapers, mothers, fathers, and siblings read official letters from the War Department informing them that their boys had perished on some field in France. Joy and optimism quickly turned into sorrow and anguish in New Orleans. Then a second blow landed in 1918, when returning soldiers brought with them not only horrific stories of the violence they faced in Europe, but also a deadly plague, the Spanish flu. Due to how graphic the scenes of death were in the trenches of World War I, we often forget that the Spanish flu was the real killer of 1918. The total number of deaths in the 4 years of World War I are estimated around 17 million, including soldiers and civilians. In the 2 years that the Spanish flu ripped through the world population, it killed around 50 million people, with some estimates ranging upwards of twice that number. New Orleans was hit harder than most cities. By 1918, its military camps were densely packed with soldiers returning from the war. These camps were perfect breeding grounds for disease, and it quickly spread within them. Then the soldiers would head into town for some entertainment, or nurses tending to the sick would come home to their children. The city's victory against the yellow fever epidemics of the recent past gave them a false sense of security, and the New Orleans Board of Health was confident that the Spanish flu would be no problem for them to handle. As the disease spread rapidly through the city, this confidence was shattered. In one day, 147 people died from the flu. By the end of the year, the total deaths reached 3,362, about 1% of New Orleans' population, and double the rate of comparable cities. The only tool the Board of Health had to fight the epidemic was keeping sick people away from healthy ones. The identity of New Orleans was heavily tied to parties, parades, carnivals, balls, and other social events. All of these had to be canceled to prevent the population from being wiped out from disease. This was not without precedent, as in 1879, the Mardi Gras celebrations in the city were canceled due to a devastating outbreak of yellow fever. Still, the people of New Orleans were starving for something happy and hopeful after the bitter sadness of World War I, so the canceling of Mardi Gras in 1918 was especially heartbreaking. It doubly hurt because 1918 was the bicentennial of the founding of New Orleans, which was set to see the most extravagant displays of New Orleans culture in history before the epidemic shut it down. And the epidemic wasn't the only thing hindering the rolling of good times in the Crescent City. It was at this point that we want to go back and look at the, if you'll pardon the phrase, the story of Storyville. Since its founding, New Orleans had had a bit of an identity crisis. On one hand, it was the seat of colonial power in French Louisiana, home to the nobles and governors who reigned as direct appendages of the French crown in the New World. As time went on, different groups took the mantle of power in New Orleans, and I'm not just talking about ethnic groups like the Spanish and Anglo-Americans. When America bought Louisiana and kept New Orleans as the seat of power in the new state, the Republican traditions allowed power to pass from appointed governors to elected ones, wresting the control over the city away from the entrenched noble elites. Except not really. Instead, it was the wealthy, politically connected men of New Orleans who were eligible to be nominated and elected for the important offices in the city. It was this class that saw New Orleans as a place for high culture. The French Opera House, sophisticated ballrooms, and fancy restaurants were their habitats. As much as these elites enjoyed the rich history and tradition of high art in the city, they were also constantly anxious about the image that New Orleans presented to the outside world. Because there was another side to the city that clashed with the elite's view of their clean and proper home. This was the side of the oppressed masses of New Orleans, who had been there just as long as the elites and had just as much, if not more, of a claim to ownership of the city. Native Americans, African slaves, immigrant laborers, the poor, the destitute, the ones whose blood and sweat literally built the city. They poured more than just their strength into New Orleans. They poured their very lives into it and made it their own. From Congo Square to the saloons and the streets, their cultural fingerprints were everywhere. Some of the elites enjoyed this side of New Orleans' character just as much as the high societal garb, but they always opined that such beautiful art and music should be created by such so-called dirty people. Those that despised the popular and in their minds vulgar culture of New Orleans knew that they couldn't completely excise it from the city, just as they couldn't excise the oppressed groups as long as they relied on their labor to keep the city alive. Instead, they wanted these groups to fade into the background of the Crescent City, to be seen as little as possible, in order to maintain a pristine image to the outside world. The way to do this was segregated zoning. The poor lived in separate parts of town, and these parts were even further segregated into ethnic and racial conclaves to prevent working-class solidarity to arise. This segregation kept the low art mostly outside of the respectable parts of town. Bourbon Street in particular became a popular spot for the poor to congregate and enjoy their culture. But even this was a bit too close to the nice part of New Orleans for the wealthy's taste. So in 1897, the alderman Sidney Story proposed a plan to deregulate a district in the Treme neighborhood in order to hopefully entice the unwelcome, disreputable folks of New Orleans to migrate there. This district, which is soon to gain the moniker Storyville, to the alderman's chagrin, was just outside the French Quarter. Close enough for the poor to walk to, but far enough away that the rich wouldn't have to look at it. In Storyville, anything went. Gambling, prostitution, liquor, drugs. It was a red light district, which to the good upstanding citizens of New Orleans made it a haven for sin. Those with less of a stick up their asses saw Storyville as freedom, complete and undiluted liberty to do, to create, and to mingle. While Storyville initially started as an attempt only to relocate all prostitution in the city to a more discreet place, the world's oldest profession had a tendency to bring its friends along with it. Anyone hoping to cash in on the business of all the people, either pre- or post-romantic rendezvous, set up shop in Storyville. Soon, alongside all the brothels were bars, music halls, restaurants, and casinos. Naturally, all these places needed some form of entertainment to draw guests in from outside and to keep them buying drinks, gambling, or seeking company. Now, at the beginning, all of these establishments were segregated. Even the brothels catered to specific ethnicities, with there being an official guide called the Blue Book that listed all the prostitutes in the district with their name, address, and whether they were black, white, mixed race, Jewish, or French. This also meant that certain establishments could only hire white entertainers or black entertainers. The demand versus the number of black entertainers meant that the musicians of New Orleans were given free rein to perform whatever they wanted to as long as they brought in customers. As a result, there was an explosion of musical experimentation concentrated in the few city blocks of Storyville. All the musical traditions that had swirled around New Orleans, from Congo Square, Caribbean immigrants, Irish jigs and reels, ragtime, and hundreds more came together in this place to create something new. This something would later be known as jazz. Over time, jazz and the black musicians who pioneered it became more and more popular, to the point that white establishments needed jazz musicians in order to stay competitive in the market. At first, they tried to fill the demand with white musicians who had learned some jazz from their black colleagues, but simply weren't enough of them to go around, and so Storyville was forced to integrate. So by the 1910s, Storyville became more of a radical egalitarian laboratory, cooking up cultural genius alongside a libertine social circle that bucked the conservative mood of the era. If you can picture the hedonism and euphoria of the Roaring Twenties that characterized America in the post-war years, then you can picture what Storyville was like for the few decades earlier. In fact, some of the greatest contributions to the Roaring Twenties came precisely because Storyville was disbanded. Like popping a cork on a champagne bottle, as soon as Storyville was no longer around to contain jazz, it spewed forth across America to completely redefine the culture of the country. But we are getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Why, you may ask, was Storyville dissolved? Well, to understand that, we must first understand that the red light district was always controversial. It was a compromise between the material reality that there would always be demand for the immoral practices that Storyville exemplified, and the conservative voices who wanted New Orleans to be purified of sin. These voices grew louder and louder as Storyville became more successful and drew more attention over time. In 1908, a new train line was put in that connected Storyville with the central business district on Canal Street. Suddenly, Storyville wasn't secluded on the outskirts of town. It was easy to access it from the busiest part of New Orleans. This brought it more attention, and groups like the American Social Hygiene Organization began calling for the city to shut it down. At first, Mayor Berman was happy to ignore these private citizens and their complaints. He had a more pragmatic view of Storyville and knew that if he shut it down, it would just disseminate across the rest of the city, making it harder to manage so-called immoralism. He famously stated to the public that you can make it illegal, but you can't make it unpopular, showing that he understood that closing Storyville would not stop people from seeking out prostitution, gambling, or jazz. But then, in 1917, the sanctimonious crowd got a big boost from America joining the First World War. During this time, New Orleans was flooded with soldiers on their way to Europe, and if there is one thing common among soldiers everywhere, it is that they love to dull the fear and pain of combat with vice. So Storyville became a popular destination for soldiers embarking from New Orleans. Venereal disease, alcohol poisoning, and even a few murders brought the ire of Secretary of War Newton Baker down upon Storyville. He was later joined by Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels in calling for the closure of Storyville immediately and the complete outlawing of prostitution everywhere in New Orleans. Again, Mayor Berman voiced his opposition to this idea, but eventually the pressure of two extremely powerful federal departments forced his hand. On November 12, 1917, he officially signed the act that closed Storyville. Well, the only thing he outlawed there was prostitution, but since this was the major draw of Storyville, the district's other sources of entertainment slowly declined during the 1920s, as just as Berman and many others predicted, the practice simply dispersed itself across New Orleans, just now underground. As for the jazz musicians of the Red Light District, some stayed and continued to make music in the birthplace of their art form. Others, like young Louis Armstrong, Joe King Oliver, and Jelly Roll Morton, took what they had learned in Storyville and brought it with them as they migrated north to the great urban centers of Chicago and New York. These northern industrial cities would become bright new nodes in a network of jazz tradition that originated from its heart in New Orleans. As jazz radiated out across the country from New Orleans, there was a similar pattern localized within the city, centralized in Storyville. Just as Mayor Berman said, the act of criminalizing prostitution did not make it unpopular. Dozens of secret underground brothels popped up in various parts of the Crescent City. These would soon be joined in 1920 by speakeasies, when a nationwide prohibition of alcohol went into effect. We will discuss these in more detail when we cover the Roaring Twenties next episode, but for now we will just make note that the illegality of these brothels and speakeasies meant that they were not subjected to the segregation laws that other businesses were. Many remained segregated due to the cultural attitudes entrenched in the South, but some also became havens for black and white people to spend time together and enjoy some shared entertainment interests, principally jazz. It is here that we run into a little organizational problem. We have already covered most of the big events that occurred between 1900 and 1920, but we still have some time left in the episode. We don't want to start it in on the Roaring Twenties, since with only about 15 minutes left we wouldn't be able to cover any topic in a satisfactory way. But the silver lining is that this gives us a chance to dig a bit deeper into the early 1900s, which was in many ways a transitional period between the Gilded Age South and the pre-Depression party era. One thing that came about in this period that we should make special note of is the Mardi Gras crew called the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club. The idea for this crew was conceived of in 1908. As the story goes, a group of working-class black men who all belonged to a mutual aid society called the Tramps went and saw a vaudeville skit in New Orleans about the famous African people called the Zulus. This show supposedly inspired the men to rebrand the Tramps as the Zulus and to march in next year's Mardi Gras parade wearing stereotypical tribal costumes. This would later become a source of contention in the black community, as some saw the costumes as degrading and insulting, while others thought they were just in the spirit of fun that Mardi Gras was about. But the whole issue wouldn't come to a head until the 1960s, so for now we will try and remain in the early 1900s. The group that marched in 1909 was not an officially incorporated crew, but they did nominate a king, just like the Comus crew. Their king was decked out in a lard can crown and banana stalk scepter, presumably to poke fun at their own lower-class background and further differentiate themselves from the opulent get-ups of the richer white crews. 1915 was the first time the group built a float for the parade, and this too was made of more affordable materials than their counterparts. The next year, the group was finally incorporated, and the Zulus became the first official black crew in New Orleans' Mardi Gras celebrations. They would continue to participate throughout the years as one of the most prominent crews in Carnival, even being the first crew to feature a queen alongside the traditional king, until the controversy of the 1960s decimated its membership. It took a while for the crew to recover, as its lowest point, there were only 15 members left who would associate themselves with the group, but in the 70s and 80s, it really returned to the forefront of the crews by welcoming members from separate racial backgrounds, making it not only the first black crew in New Orleans, but also the first racially integrated one. The Zulus of the early 1900s were pioneers in many aspects that are now ubiquitous throughout Carnival crews, but a couple that we should make special note of came from Storyville. These would be the brass bands that marched with the Zulus and would soon carry the sound of jazz throughout the streets of New Orleans as they marched in the parades, and also the inclusion of exotic dancers alongside them. The women who, shall we say, plied their wares in Storyville, were outcasts from society. Although prostitution allowed many to make a decent living, and some lucky ones even became quite wealthy, following in the tradition of concubinage that New Orleans had had for hundreds of years, with wealthy patrons lifting their favorite girls out of poverty with lavish gifts. For the majority of Storyville's working women, and especially the women of color, their profession consigned them to a life of pauperism and ostracization. Perhaps that is why they naturally gravitated to the celebrations of Carnival, which were a space that allowed all the misfits and outcasts of New Orleans' social scene to show off their authentic and audacious selves. According to oral legend, the prominence of these promiscuous women within the Mardi Gras parades began in the early 1900s, when women of black Storyville clashed with a group from the more privileged part of Storyville. The exact origin of this feud is unknown. There were a lot of reasons for black women to resent their lighter-skinned counterparts. For one, black Storyville was not as rich or as legal as the rest of the district. Often policemen would raid black brothels and gambling houses, despite the fact that they were just as legal as the white ones. There was also the issue of religion. Many African American women were Protestants, while white or mixed-race Creoles predominantly practiced Catholicism. Whatever the reason, the black women came up with a plan to embarrass and show up their rivals with a display in that year's carnival. This group dubbed themselves the $1 Million Baby Dolls, and danced through the streets of New Orleans in frilly, revealing outfits and sang risque tunes. They became such a huge hit that every year since then, there have been groups that have copied the style and performance of these women and have taken up the moniker of Baby Dolls. However, the Baby Dolls were not the first people to see Mardi Gras and other carnival celebrations as a vehicle for embracing and showcasing their community's unique cultural traditions. For almost 200 years, African slaves, Native Americans, and Caribbean laborers were parading through the streets of New Orleans to celebrate their own festivals. As Mardi Gras grew and grew during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it pulled in and assimilated these smaller parades. Perhaps the most recognizable of these influences these lesser-known parades had on Mardi Gras are the Mardi Gras Indians. Able to be spotted from miles away in their beautiful, elaborate handmade suits and instantly recognizable by their outstanding chants and music. Just like the Baby Dolls, the Indians were founded in the spirit of competition, with rival tribes trying to outdo one another in confrontations on so-called battlefields. In the early days, these battlefields actually saw a fair amount of physical violence, but over time this practice was phased out in favor of more friendly performances and displays of the artistry of each tribe. While it is hard to situate the origin of the Mardi Gras Indians, we chose to include them in this episode, as they undoubtedly rose to prominence during this period, as did many of the now staple characters of New Orleans' most important cultural product. Okay, well, maybe Mardi Gras is eclipsed by one other cultural product, one that coincidentally also came into being in the early 1900s. We have already touched on jazz's inception in the Mad Musical Science Laboratory of Storyville, but just like any other movement that organically grows out of many intertwining older traditions, it can be nearly impossible to pinpoint the exact moment of birth of the genre. Instead, we will cover a few important early figures in jazz's history to better understand how they were influenced by the unique musical blend in New Orleans to create the cultural phenomenon that would take America by storm in the 1920s and 30s. The first of these figures we will cover, who is often cited as the first true jazz musician, was New Orleans native Buddy Bolden. Born Charles Bolden in 1877, young Buddy got his musical start playing cornet in one of New Orleans' many brass bands. These bands often played a combination of military songs and the syncopated rhythms of newly established African American ragtime. As we have covered in previous episodes, this syncopated, swinging rhythm was nothing new to the New Orleans black community. They had been playing music like this in Congo Square since just about the very beginning of the city. Over the generations, however, the music had morphed and changed, tying in other traditions from different parts of Africa and the Caribbean, splintering off into ragtime and blues, all coming back onto one another to create a sort of audio kaleidoscope of ever-fractaling sounds. Buddy came of age, brought up among this swirling tempest of music, to pioneer his own style, which would cause many later to cite him as the first jazz musician. His career was relatively short, with his band forming in 1895 and him being committed to a psychiatric hospital 11 years later due to a bad case of schizophrenia. But during those 11 years, he made quite a name for himself, performing with his band in various dance halls and parades. Given how short his time in the spotlight was, it is even more remarkable how much of an impact Buddy made to the music scene. Even though most of what we know about him comes from oral history, and many of the aspects of his life are shrouded in myth-making. While most of this impact came after his death in 1931, when jazz really exploded in popularity, he was quite provocative during his own time. Specifically, his most famous song, Funky Butt, was so much of a departure from accepted musical canon that singing it could get you arrested by the New Orleans police. One of the artists influenced by Buddy Bolden was fellow New Orleanian Jelly Roll Morton, who was born just a few blocks away and a few years later than Buddy. Morton was an eccentric character and probably one of the reasons that all the early jazz innovators get painted as rebellious troublemakers. It was also one of the reasons why early jazz was so often associated with the prostitution business. Jelly Roll got his start as a piano player in brothels in the Storyville district. In fact, his nickname, Jelly Roll, was a euphemistic phrase used to describe African American women's private parts. Contrary to his reputation as a brash opponent of the establishment, Jelly Roll was probably the artist most responsible for bringing jazz out of the periphery and establishing it as a proper musical genre. He was the first musician to write down jazz compositions using notation, and he proved that it could be both free-flowing improvisational art while also having a solid structure of chords and tempo. Now, because he was the first to write down jazz music, Jelly Roll often claimed to have invented the genre, which brings up the question as to who really gets to claim ownership of a thing like that. Is it the street performer who came up with the music, or the man who committed it to record? Maybe in a couple hundred years, when the oral history of this relatively new art form has been forgotten, scholars will only have Jelly Roll's signed manuscripts as evidence of who was the first jazz artist. But for now, we can contest this claim. That isn't to say that he didn't have a huge impact on the early formation of the jazz scene, because he certainly did. Not only did he play a part in jazz's early development in the brothels of New Orleans, but he was also one of the first to bring the art form north, to Chicago. His 1915 composition, called Jelly Roll Blues, was written and recorded in Chicago and is considered one of the first jazz compositions. Note that at this time, the music coming out of the African American scene in New Orleans was still being called blues, but it would soon gain its own identity, though not at first from its supporters. The first time the word jazz, that is JAS, was used to describe the type of music Jelly Roll and his colleagues were making was in 1915 in Chicago. Then, a year later in 1916, the Times-Picayune in New Orleans wrote an article about jazz bands in the city. It wasn't until Broadway decided to spice up the word that the spelling changed from JASS to the more familiar JAZZ. All the while, the name was being used by critics to deride the musical genre as chaotic and dirty. But just like in the way Jelly Roll chose his nickname as a kind of ironic nod to his less traditional origins, the artists who played jazz claimed the derisive term and turned it into a source of pride. The last thing we will touch on from the birth time of jazz is one more famous figure to come out of New Orleans in the early 1900s. While there are hundreds of important artists who played in this one place during this one time, and all of them had their own special contribution to the musical tradition of America, due to the constraints of time, we only have time for one more, and so it should be reserved for perhaps the most famous son of the Crescent City, that is, Louis Armstrong. Louis was born in New Orleans a few years after Jelly Roll Morton in 1901. By the time Louis was 7 years old, Buddy Bolden's health had already deteriorated to the point that he was no longer able to regularly play his new style of improvised cornet music in the streets of New Orleans. But the young Louis would have certainly grown up hearing stories from his musical idols of the strange and beautiful sound that Buddy had pioneered. In particular, Armstrong's mentor, King Oliver, often spoke of Buddy Bolden's music as he tutored Louis during his stint playing on the riverboats of New Orleans. While Armstrong would get his musical education in New Orleans, it wouldn't be until after he left the city that he would really make a name for himself. In 1918, after Storyville was shut down and the noose of Jim Crow began to really restrict the ability of black jazz musicians to perform in the South, many fled north to the relative liberty of Chicago and New York. One of these jazz refugees was King Oliver, who left his post in some of the most prominent brass bands in New Orleans to his protege. Though this would only last about 4 years, as in 1922, Armstrong followed Oliver to Chicago, where his career really took off. But we will go over the rest of Louis Armstrong's story in later episodes, as he leaves the city in the time frame we are focused on. He would return to the city in the 30s and 40s, and later in the 60s we will pick up his story when we get to these points. For now, we must look forward to the raucous years of the 1920s in New Orleans. As a convenient bookend, the year 1920 would see the ousting of the Berman administration. He and the Ring Democrats ran the city for the entirety of this episode's time frame, and it is fitting that so revolutionary a decade of the 1920s should begin with an upending of the calcified political scene. Next time we will discuss the incoming new New Orleans order, its failures, and how the city survived and transformed under the strange contradictions of the 1920s. So please join me in the next episode for the history of New Orleans.